Probably we're discussing, Africa's history, going all the way back, Nile Valley civilization, origin of man, etc. I think we've kind of brought things up to where the second rise of Europe, in terms of after the Arab Moorish domination from 7th century to late 15th century, shall we say 1492. I want us to go from there because certainly now Europe is becoming dominant and we're approaching the slave trade. But I want us to back up a little bit and have an understanding of what was going on with the Arabs in terms of their involvement, not just in North Africa, but certainly East Africa, going all the way down to Mozambique. And, I want to start off like you're filling us in, because the Portuguese gained naval superiority, let's say in the 1400s. And we know that by 1487, they had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, led by people like Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama. And they now had access, shall we say, as traders to the treasures of East Africa. And then they sort of interacted then with the Arabs who were there previously. And of course, they're also going to get involved in the slave trade in terms of the west coast of Africa and certainly Central Africa. But, what had been happening, and perhaps it was going on, I think, probably before the 7th century, in terms of the Arabs in East Africa. That Arabs were a dominant trading power in Eastern Africa, engaging in gold and ivory. Certainly there were intermediaries between the East Coast of Africa and, let's say, India and China and Indonesia. There's evidence of that. Their strongholds were in places like Zanzibar, Pemba, and Kilwa, and then on the east coast of Mozambique, and in terms of the interior of Africa. But I think that the Arabs at that point in time in East Africa didn't really pose a threat to African institutions because they intermarried with the Africans and became Africanized. And is that the basis of this whole Swahili culture, et cetera, et cetera? Can you take us through that?
Yes, I can.
Part and the Arabs before we get into the Arab slave trade.
Yes, I can do that, sir. The East African civilization was Bantu. The Swahili language is a Bantu language. And if you want to judge it in terms of purity, it might be the second purest Bantu of the Bantu languages after Kikongo. How you judge purity is there's a certain list of words that scholars use, words for different parts of the face, different parts of the body, words that you wouldn't borrow from any other culture, and compare that to what they call Proto-Bantu to see how many of those words have survived. And in the case of Swahili, it has the second highest figure of all the Bantu languages, second only to Kikongo. So the Swahili civilization is a Black African civilization. It's not an Arab civilization. The idea that it was an Arab civilization is Eurocentric scholars engaging in fraud. And they have fooled so many generations of scholars with their fraudulence. It's shocking. And we have to shout out some scholars like England's Dr. Basil Davidson, England's Mark Horton, who have actually tried to tell the truth and say, no, this is not Arab, this is African. But there were some foreigners there, but those foreigners weren't Arabs, they were Persians. And we know this because some intermarriage did happen between Persian elites and African elites, because the Persians, their remains have been found buried in the elite tombs. But the Swahili civilization really is a Black African or a Bantu civilization. It's not Arab. And so the glories of Kilwa, Zanzibar, all the way up to as far north as Brava, Mogadishu in Somalia, as far south as Sofala in Mozambique. That was an African civilization. And Black people should take great pride in that civilization. Some of the greatest architecture in African history, houses of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 stories, an aesthetic that they call Swahili chic, which you could build houses like that today and rich Black people would like to live in. I saw an article on, you know, the supermodel Naomi Campbell?
Yes.
Yeah, you know, she has a mansion in Kenya, and that mansion is built in a semi-Swahili style. And you can, those of you watching this, Google Naomi Campbell mansion in Kenya and see it for yourself. So what she is living in is traditional but grand African architecture. The Swahili civilization was a civilization of splendor, of grandeur. I mean, I've explored some of the ruins. I went to sites like Jumbala Matwana, Munarani, Gedi. I visited these places. I went to the various museums. Very, very impressive. But your average Kenyan doesn't know that that's his history. He thinks it's Arab history because of the psychological damage done by the propaganda put out there by lying archaeologists like James Kirkman, and his nonsense has essentially mashed Black people up in separating them from their history and their heritage. Right now, there is a Swahili archaeologist, Professor Felix Chama, who is trying to spread the message to his people that this is your history, claim it. So big up to Felix Chama. But at present, your average Kenyan, I can speak for Kenya because I've been there, doesn't know this stuff. They think it's Arab. Now, credit to the museums. The museums do make it clear Swahili is Bantu. Yeah, but your general public, including the guides that were taking me around these sites, you know, and then I asked them some obvious questions. But who was buried here? They had to admit Africans were buried there. And then I said, but doesn't that tell you Africans built this? Oh, but they were the slaves. And that shows just how much the propaganda has kicked in. Do you see? Now, the other things too about the trading, the ships, you know, the ships were called dhows. Unfortunately, the term dhow is also used in the Arab world. And that gives the impression that the shipping was Arab. In fact, those ships were African, right? Yeah. So consequently, the people sailing from East Africa to Oman, East Africa to India, East Africa to China, East Africa to Cambodia, where they established a colony, East Africa too. You know that there's new evidence that those East Africans probably landed on the northern fringes of Australia, and they got there 600 years before Captain Cook. A British right-wing newspaper called the Daily Mail has an article, which I use as teaching material, called How 900-Year-Old African Coins Ended Up in Australia. There's a whole article. Again, people watching this, Google it, get that article from the Daily Mail. And the coins came from Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania. And those coins date back to around about 11th, 12th century, something like that. And they were discovered on the northern fringes of Australia. And therefore, the likeliest theory is that's where East Africans were sailing to. You may already know that East Africans from Mombasa, which on a modern map is in Kenya, sent the Emperor of China a giraffe, and that giraffe landed in 1414. And there's a Chinese painting where there's a giraffe in the painting, and that confirms the story of 1414.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that there were East African traders in China, and there's a Chinese document that mentions them. And the Chinese document has got the name of the trader, and then when you translate it from the Chinese characters, his surname is given as the Zanj, yeah. And so
black Zanj.
So Zanj is the word, part of the word Zanzibar.
Okay.
Yeah, and the term Zanj means black. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And in other languages like Turkish, Zenci is their version of the same word Zanj, and Zenci is also black. Yeah, a term used for black people. It's not the only term Turks use, but Zanj, Zenci, same thing. Zanzibar, same thing. So Zanzibar was originally a black civilization before the Arabs took it over in 1698. And so the East African history was an African history before the Arabs took them over, 1698.
Wow. You know, what's interesting is, you know, when you read about things, you hear about, you know, the Portuguese, as I just mentioned, traveling around the Cape and getting to East Africa. But the talk about them getting there and shall we say, encountering, you know, the Arab presence in.
Let me answer that.
Go ahead.
That's probably European scholars lying. What they encountered was an Islamic presence, not an Arab presence. The Portuguese, I've got the first Portuguese account, and it's written by a scholar called Duarte Barbosa, and he's writing somewhere around 1517, and he describes the people along the coast, and he describes what they looked like, what they were wearing, and so on, so forth. Now, he does say some of them weren't black. He does say that. But those people would have been traders, but then that doesn't make them Arab. Do you see? Yeah. And those would have been traders but generally speaking, what Duarte Barbosa describes, he talks about how they dressed, and they would wear capes, and then underneath the cape, the men would be bare-chested, and then they'd be wearing a kind of kilt. And that type of dress, we now know exactly which African ethnic group that is. It's the Mijikenda. The Mijikenda is the ethnic group that we could rename Swahili. Do you see? Yeah, so we know exactly which group of Africans it was.
You know, that brings, you know, great clarity. I just want to sort of finish up that period, shall we say, in terms of the Portuguese, you know, coming around the Cape and encountering this, and of course, they wanted to exert their influence, so they plundered, you know, Kilwa, as we were talking about, which is a major commercial port of East Africa, in 1502, and Zanzibar in 1503. And you know, and continued until they destroyed everything, and I think they attacked Sofala, as you mentioned, back in 1531. So that led to the decline of that, shall we say, autonomous East African trade.
Absolutely,
by the Portuguese.
Yeah, but the people that they were attacking, certainly the people that they were attacking were Muslims, but these were African Muslims.
Again, that gives great clarity. Yes.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, having visited the sites myself, or some of them, certainly the ones in Kenya, Muslims weren't the only black people that were there. If you visit these sites, you'll notice that there's always a mosque, which will be the site of Islam. but there's also always a baobab tree. And baobab trees, all the guides told me the same thing. They were used by the non-Muslims as places of sanctity and so on, so on and so forth, which would suggest that not every Swahili was Islamic. There would have been those that converted, and there would have been those that kept to traditional religions, and they were both there on the coast.
Can you say something about now? Let's back up to the Arab slave trade, because we have not discussed that at all. You know, we've discussed, as we mentioned, that, you know, the 7th century Arab influence and especially Islamic influence going across North Africa, going into Europe. I think now we just discussed some of that trade, Islamic as well as Arab trade there on the east coast of Africa. Now, how did the Arab slave trade of Africa develop? Because certainly it preceded, you know, the European slave trade. You know, long before the European slave trade, certainly Africans were, you know, sold into slavery in the Middle East. And I think you mentioned that about Persia, and, you know, because we know that there were slave revolts in Mesopotamia. There are large numbers of in Mesopotamia. Can you take us through that period?
The truth here is there's a lot that we don't know because the historians don't really want to go there, right? So there's a lot that we don't know, but this is what we can infer. The Arabs conquered Egypt, or began their conquest of Egypt, in December 639 AD, right? From there, they seized what is today Libya. After that, they seized what is today Tunisia. In those days, it would have been Carthage. They seized Algeria, Morocco. These places would have been called Mauritania back in the day. And they seized all of these places. And by 708 AD, the whole of North Africa was under Arab rule. Now, no one wants to say this explicitly, but we can deduce that the indigenous North Africans were the first group of people to be mass enslaved and deported in chains to the Middle East. Right? No one wants to say that because they don't want to admit that North Africans were originally Africans, and they don't want to admit that those people were the first victims of Arab slavery like that. Yeah. But even when you read in between the lines, even people that try to deny that the original North Africans were Africans will admit that the Prophet of Islam was sent a black slave called Maria the Copt. They all say that. Right? Now, how did Maria the Copt, Maria the Egyptian, become a black slave if there were no black people there? Again, no scholar wants to address that, but yeah. So that would be your first wave then of Africans being enslaved. And then they would have ended up in the Middle East. They would have ended up in places like Basra. They would have ended up in places, in other places in Mesopotamia, where, as you rightly say, 7th century to the 9th century, there was such a concentration of black people in the Middle East that they were able to stage uprisings known as the Revolt of the Zenge. The same word we were talking about before, Zenge, Zanzibar, Zenchi, it's the same word, right? Okay, so, and the Revolt of the Zenge is a great history in itself, you know, enslaved people overthrowing and that kind of thing. Right? Then the permanent, if you like, presence of Arabians in North Africa, where they had largely now displaced the original inhabitants. They were able to set up trading networks across the Sahara. And in those trading networks, you now had people south of the Sahara being captured and then sent across to North Africa in trading caravans. Would you like to study Black history or Pan-African heritage but don't know where to start? Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. We have a complete home study online Black history or Pan-African heritage course aimed at you. You can study in your own time and at your own pace. You will systematically learn every major theme in Black history going all the way back. And the people that manned those trading caravans were, sad to say, Black people, the Tuaregs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you had that kind of thing happening. And then there was an empire in medieval West Central Africa called Kanem Bornu.
Mm-hmm.
And Kanem Bornu, a lot of their, it's an empire. So you've got the King of Kings, and then you've got the different states. And the states are the Arabs, by keeping the kings in debt, would then request of the kings, well, pay us your debt and pay us your debt in people. And that meant Kanem Bornu became seriously involved in trafficking Black people from south of the Sahara, across the Sahara into North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way the slavery thing happened. And then in 1698, Arabs from Oman and Muscat, and it has to be said, some of those Arabs from Oman were then and are now Black. Mm-hmm. Sorry to say, but this is the truth. They took control of East Africa. They made Zanzibar the center of their operation. So Zanzibar, which used to be a grand African city, was now being turned into a slave market. Mm. And then by the time we get to the 19th century, I've got a source that says, by 1839, Zanzibar was pulling out 40 to 45,000 Africans per year in mass enslavement. Mm. And not only that, you had Arabs and Afro-Arabs and so on and so forth. You've heard of somebody called Tipu Tip, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. He was half Arab, half African, but if you actually look at the images of him, he's actually Black. Yeah. So he was presumably half Omani, half African. He was on some serious nonsense. And places like Tanzania, Uganda, Eastern Congo, these places were being devastated by mass enslavement by the likes of Tipu Tip and the other people controlling East Africa from Oman. And that resulted in a lot of horror during that time period, especially the 19th century. Mm. So the reason I'm clearing this up is to make it clear that East Africa did have an African history before 1698. After 1698, it's not an African history anymore. Do you see?
Mm-hmm. As we are going to get into the European, slave trade, beginning with the Portuguese, I think it's important for us to define slavery, because it's a word that's bandied about, and we know that Africans had slaves, so slavery was not new to Africa. Can you distinguish or describe a difference between, and of course we haven't gone into the European slave trade, but let's say slavery in Africa, the Arab slave trade, and then what we're going to come up to next as the European slave trade. Is there a difference in how the slaves were treated, or the concept of slavery in those three types of slavery?
Big differences. Let me explain. Mm-hmm. In Africa, it was common to enslave people that were captured in war. So if there's a war, A fights B, B loses. The men of B captured would end up enslaved by A. Mm-hmm. And that would be one way that someone could be enslaved. Another way is if you got into debt. Mm-hmm. The person that you are in debt to, you would have to work off that debt. Again, that would be another way that people would be enslaved. Mm-hmm. Professor Sheikh Anta Diop talks about how it worked in West Africa, where there was such a thing called the slave of the father's household and the slave of the mother's household. if you were a slave of the mother's household, that essentially meant you were a domestic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so there's different ways that it would work, but the stripping of somebody of their humanity wasn't how it was done in African cultures. So if you look at the writings of, for example, Oluda Equiano, he was an Igbo, but his people were captured and enslaved by the Empire of Benin. And so he talks about what it was like being a slave under the Empire of Benin and how things changed when he became a slave of the Europeans, where it's a very, very different situation. Very, very different. So slavery in African countries was a lot like serfdom in European countries. Again, this isn't to make it right, but this is to put it in its accurate context. I have researched the Songhai Empire, and I've written a book on it, which is quite possibly the most detailed book there is on the empire. And there's a source for primary material, and the source is the Tariq el-Fatash, which is one of the Timbuktu Chronicles. And it talks about 24 slave clans that belonged to the Songhai royalty. And it explained what did that mean. And this is what it meant. There'll be one clan whose job it was to supply the royal household with fish, right? And so a certain amount of fish would have to be caught and then sent to the royal household. Did you know that they means tested it? So if you could afford to send more fish, you sent more fish. And if you couldn't afford to send more fish, you sent less fish. And there's a means test to this. Then you would have, once you've fulfilled your quota for the royal household, you work for yourself. And that was consistent. There'd be another clan responsible for making the king's saddles. Once you've made your quota of king's saddles, everything else, you work for yourself. And then what would happen is there was a controversy, and the writer of the Tariq el-Fatash makes a big story of this. One of the slaves had did an act of charity by giving away a whole bunch of wealth. And the story then got to the Askia that a slave had given away all this wealth. So the Askia calls a council to find out, well, what could he do to trump what the slave did? And there's a whole 10-page story where the advisors are working out how can they trump what the slave did. Do you see? And can you see now that gives enslaved people in West Africa a lot more dignity. Oh, there's even a story, by the way, of one of the slaves leaving without permission to Mecca and coming back and not being punished. Yeah.
Were there periods of enslavement defined, or was it slavery for life in most cases? Let's say you were captured in war. Would you remain a slave forever in terms of if you lost that war and you became a slave to the victor?
It varied. We know for a fact that people did go from slave to emperor. We know that for a fact. There was a book written by a French journalist called Timbuktu the Mysterious. And the book is about the Songhai Empire. And there's a bit where the author, Major Felix Dubois, talked about trying to find copies of, you know, the book I've just mentioned, Tariq el-Fatash? He tried to get copies. He couldn't get any copies because here's why. People burned them. Why did they burn them? Because the book showed that their family, they're now rich, their family began life as slaves. And because their family is mentioned in the book Tariq el-Fatash, you try and buy up all the manuscript copies and burn them. Yeah. What does this prove? It proves you can go from slave to elite. Yeah. And that did indeed happen. That level of social mobility was indeed possible.
Okay, can you contrast that with Arab slavery, or is there any difference between Arab slavery and European slavery? Because we will get mostly to European slavery as we go down the road. Would you say that the Arabs were more benign than the Europeans in terms of their enslavement?
There was some differences. Now, in the Arab world, we know for a fact, excuse me, in the Islamic world, I won't say Arab, in the Islamic world, we know for a fact that a black person could end up in slavery and end up as king. We know this because that happened with Malik Ambar in India, where he ended up ruling 1/20th of Greater India between 1600 and 1626. We know that in India, black people captured by Islamic forces ended up as elite slaves. Elites mean that you're actually working for the king. So the king's police, the king's bodyguard, the king's ministers, a lot of them were enslaved Africans. But we're using the term enslaved because they belong to the king. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But they're actually running the country. And they're actually in high status positions, much higher than your average Indian during that time period. Do you see? Yeah. And these people were known as Sidis. These people were known as Habshis. And there are two dynasties that these Africans created in India. And those dynasties lasted right up until the time of when the British conquered them, British Raj. Yeah. So that kind of stuff did happen. Now, here's the downside. What the Arabs did, though, which was cruel, is they did castrate African slaves. And so what that meant was African slaves did not have, the next generation, the next generation, the next generation because of that. And they did subject African women.
Was that routine?
Not necessarily routine, but it happened in enough places in the Islamic world for us to say, notice that. So, for example, I am told that in Turkey, during the time of the Ottomans, the fourth most powerful position in the Ottoman regime was the head of the harem, and that was often an African. So the fourth most powerful person was an African, but he would have been castrated.
Yeah.
So consequently, he's not having a dynasty. Does that make sense? Yeah. And that kind of thing definitely happened. In the case with African women were always highly, highly, highly prized in the Arab world. No one talks about this because the dowry for an African woman was higher than the dowry for an Arab woman. And I found sources that definitely say that. But what happened is a lot of kidnapping of African women went down. And in some parts of Africa, such as in Ethiopia, they became a culture in some places to put almost like a disc in your lower lip. Yeah. And what that's about is uglifying.
Where do you bang it? I think I've seen that in the Ubangi tribe, but I don't know where it's from. Yeah.
And there's a theory that was done to uglify the women, to stop them, to dissuade Arabs from kidnapping them. Do you see? Yeah. So a lot of that happened as well.
Well, we're going to get into the European slave trade, which is, I guess, in my mind, and I think in all of our minds, is probably the slave trade, because it was so destructive. I think we just talked about.
Can I jump in there, sir? Can I jump in?
Sure.
Here's the thing. A lot of people want to begin European enslavement of Africans in 1441 or thereabouts.
Yeah. That's where
we have to remember that the Romans were also slave trading Africans. The Romans, once they conquered Carthage, 146 BC, they enslaved the remnants of the Carthaginian population. They put 50,000 people into slavery. And Roman rule of North Africa was just like imperial rule anywhere. You could commit all kinds of atrocities against the people under your rule. And the Romans were ruling North Africa on and off for 700 years. Yeah.
I think that's very important. I do know that read the statement where North Africa became the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. So they definitely took over and control of that, after they defeated the Carthaginians.
Yeah.
In terms of getting back to Portugal, as you just mentioned, the first slaves, I think, that reached Portugal were in 1444, and about 35,000, followed between 1450 and 1500. And these slaves were taken to other places such as Spain, Italy, and Sicily. So those initial slaves went to Europe. And then, of course, the slave trade changed because of the need for labor in terms of the Western world, in terms of the Americas, in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of that whole agricultural demand for physical labor, and in terms of capitalist exploitation of resources. So can you take us through that now, as the Portuguese have started, and then I don't know who followed next, whether it was the Dutch and then the Spanish. Well, certainly I think the Spanish followed, and then the Dutch and the English, and we know it went down the coast from what was called the Slave Coast, which is basically, I think, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, going all the way down, certainly Central Africa to Angola, and all the way down to the Cape. Can you fill us in there?
Yes, sir. The very first raid that starts mass enslavement, my knowledge says 1441, but I have seen that date disputed. And it was indeed the Portuguese, and they landed on the coast of Morocco, saw some Moroccan citizens and kidnapped them. And then that was the beginnings of it. And then more voyages. So you had a Portuguese mariner called Antam Gonçalves, and he's the person who's credited. And as you rightly say, the kidnapped people went back to Portugal, the other places in Europe, and also the islands off the coast of Africa, Canary, Madeira, all those kind of places. And in one of those places, there was a sugar thing happening. Does that make sense? So the association of enslaved people and sugar, that happened. But because Europe didn't know the Americas existed yet, that's why no one was sent west yet. Mm-hmm. Okay, so 1441. Now, Portugal is in total control of this part of mass enslavement. All right, as they get further down the coast of Africa, they land in places like Benin. Benin is strong and powerful, so the Portuguese can't really do much there. They get to Congo, but they were able in Congo the Congolese king was quite happy to be Christianized. But the Portuguese said, but to pay for this Christianization, people, we want people. Yeah. And that's how you ended up with people being pulled out of Congo and then places next door, Angola, those kinds of places. Now, there's a whole epic story of how the Congolese and the Angolans fought back to try and stop their people from being enslaved, likes of Anne Nzinga, that kind of thing, the likes of King Garthia II. He wrote people that tried to stand up to slave trade. Then you had the Portuguese landing in Munumutapa. Munumutapa is the empire of Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa. And what the Portuguese did there was to enslave the people on the ground there. Right, and they put that into action in 1628. So after 1628, the people there were enslaved on the ground. All right, now that's the beginnings then of Spain. Portugal becoming a powerful country in the world. So Portugal became a world power. Portuguese people were everywhere, and that kind of thing. Then the Spanish were able to get to the Americas. and then come back and tell the whole of the European world this place called the Americas existed. That was bad news for the Native Americans, who were now going to be genocided.
This was 1492, 1494.
Yeah. And then us as Africans, and that was bad news. So consequently, Spain now was able to control more and more of the Americas. They destroyed the Aztec Empire, which was ruling in Mexico. They conquered the satellite states in the Caribbean and so on and so forth. And they were basically able to take over the Americas. And they did it by genocide after genocide after genocide. And in my opinion, this was the most horrible period in world history. In other words, I don't regard the enslavement of Africans as the worst crime in history. I regard it as the second worst, because we're still here. Does that make sense? A lot of Native Americans, they're not here.
As adults and parents, how much do we really know about Black history beyond Malcolm X, Mary Seacole, the slave trade, and the man who invented the traffic lights? Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret, keen to get everybody up to speed with their history and heritage. I'm giving away a powerful free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book.
Because their continent was going to be seized. North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, all of that was going to be seized. Yeah. And that's what the Spanish were doing. And then once the Spanish did that, it was, okay, now where are we going to get people from? And then they set up a contract called the Asiento. And what the contract did was to control, by monopoly, enslaved people in the Western world. And that meant then that people captured by the Portuguese ended up being sold to the Spanish in the Americas. And that's how you end up with a transfer of Africans to the Americas, which didn't happen before. Yeah.
Was that approved by the papacy at that time, or was that later?
Absolutely. The Pope blessed the slave trade from the very beginning. And again, that's some hard information because, of course, many of us today are Christians. And many of us today, it's painful to know that the religion that we follow, the person that was the head of it on this planet, blessed the slave trade from the word go. Not later, from the word go. We know that the Portuguese established an audience with the Pope somewhere around 1444. And the Pope is said to have blessed, no, wait a minute, to all those who shall be engaged in the said war, I offer complete forgiveness of your sins.
Yeah. So at least he knew it was a sin.
Yeah. This is quoted by Basil Davidson in his book. The book was originally called Black Mother, and then it was renamed The African Slave Trade. Yeah, it's in there. So what then happens is the Portuguese are capturing people, they're selling them on to the Spanish, and Black people are therefore ending up in the Western world. Then what happens is other countries get involved in the slave trade. So England gets involved in 1562 in the person of Sir John Hawkins. And what happens with Sir John Hawkins is he raided some Portuguese ships. So he didn't actually capture anybody himself. What he did was wait for the Portuguese to do a slave raid and then ramrod their ships, and he seized Africans from those ships. But because the Spanish controlled the Asiento, those captured Africans ended up in Spanish hands. And then that's when European countries realized that it's not just about capturing people in Africa. You have to have your own lands in the Americas to sell them onto. Do you see? Yeah. And then that's why Britain then ended up seizing Virginia, seizing Jamaica, seizing Barbados, Bermuda, so that when they captured Africans, they could now send them to those islands that the British control. Well, it wasn't Britain then, it's England then. Does that make sense? You know, because England hadn't become Britain then, it was England.
Yeah.
France did the same thing. They seized Louisiana, they seized Martinique, they seized Guadeloupe. The Dutch did the same thing. The Dutch colonized South Africa, 1652. They colonized Brazil. Do you see?
Mhm.
So a lot of the countries are doing, they're all copying the same model that the Spanish and the Portuguese did, but tried to get around the asiento. And then gradually all these countries are becoming part of the mass enslavement machine, and more Africans are being pulled out of Africa.
Things that I'd like you to investigate, to elaborate on, shall we say.
Yeah.
Certainly, the Portuguese didn't just come and grab slaves. I mean, they had a superiority in terms of weapons, and clearly also the others. So when they landed and demanded slaves, they were at the same time destroying the countries in which they land in order to kidnap slaves. And I just want to read a little thing here. Sir Richard Burton, the British traveler, calculated that a slave raid to capture, 50 people, destroyed at least 10 villages, each with a population of around 100 to 200 souls. And then when you think of the fact that 15 or 20% of those slaves that were put on ships, died before they got to the other side, and then when you figure, I think somebody has calculated that maybe 15 million reached the Americas, north, south, central. We're looking at in excess of 60 million that were taken out of Africa. And those bodies were taken out, and of course there were young men and women, there were intelligent young men and women, not just people with strong backs, because they would be deprived of the village, etc., etc. And the villages had to be destroyed, meaning that the nations were destroyed that the villages belonged to. So what we're seeing is a destruction of civilization in Africa, a removal of this human resource of enormous proportions. When you look at the total population of Africa at that time, I don't know, it may have been, 300 million? I don't know if you know those type of figures, but probably at least a quarter or more of the population of Africa was displaced because of the slave trade. And that's humongous in terms of African development. And we're not going to get into the change in terms of customs, because we'll do that when we get to colonialism. But this is just physical violence and terror and disruption of the civilizations at that point in time. Can you go deeper into that for us? How they were able to convince other Africans, shall we say, to sell their brothers and sisters or the next village into slavery?
Yeah, let me answer that. Mass enslavement began as kidnapping, but then it evolved into trade. Mm-hmm. And how it evolved into trade was, once you've got some Black people under your control because you've enslaved them, you can use those people to do raids on other groups of people, and they can't say no because they're enslaved. And then once you've got A raiding B, B now has to get arms to protect themselves from being raided. And then C needs to get arms to protect themselves just in case anything goes down. And then gradually you get this arms race. And then you'll get Europeans coming in to say, okay, you need arms. We can give you arms, but the deal is we want people. And so that results in what they call the enslaved people being sold for guns cycle. And that kind of thing ended up, so you ended up with African nations fighting each other, fighting each other, fighting each other. One side winning, one side losing, the other side winning, the other side losing. And meanwhile, people are disappearing. And then you get, in some situations, some ethnicities disappear entirely because the people are either dead or they flee. And the ones that flee end up joining other ethnicities. And what that means is a lot of people in Africa who think, well, I'm Yoruba. Chances are some of your ancestors are Yorubas. Some of them would have been people fleeing from elsewhere that ended up marrying in to your ethnic group. Do you see? So what happened is that was happening galore in Africa. Then you also have the de-civilization process that happens, where some people end up living in swamps, living in caves, living on hills, because that's the safest place to be, to make sure you're not slave raided. You also have this mentality of distrust of any new Africans coming into your area, because you don't know whether they are genuine refugees or whether they are agents sent there by European, or in some cases Arab enslavers, to capture you. So you can't trust nobody. And this mentality of exclusivism and distrust is the beginnings of modern tribalism. So we can trace a lot of tribalism back to what happened during that period. Also, people living in swamps, people living on hills, people living in caves, you keep them separate enough for long enough, they end up speaking a different dialect to everybody else. And then this is how you end up with a multiplicity of languages and dialects. Do you see? And then, there's a whole process of what happens, once the people are de-civilized. That you've got different names, baker, cook, that kind of thing, hunter. If the bakers end up on a ship, on a slave ship, that means that bread making in your area disappears. If the cooks end up on a slave ship, your cuisine disappears. If your tailors end up on a slave ship, your textiles disappear. And if these things disappear, you're going to have to buy them from somebody else. And if their trade route gets disrupted by slavery, you starve, you do without. And if you do without, that's the culture, that's your civilization declining. And that was going on all over Africa. I've even found out that Libya ended up a victim of transatlantic slavery. Some of their people ended up in the Americas, during the time when Colonel Gaddafi was ruling in Libya. I went on the Libyan government website, and there's a time period where they talk about their people ending up on ships that ended up transatlantic going to the Americas. Yeah.
Amazing. You made a point there that I hadn't thought of before, and maybe we can just go back to that. Are you saying that, let's say before the slave trade, what you had were nations and empires?
Yeah.
And then because of the disruption of the slave trade, you end up with different groups amalgamating here, there, and everywhere. And this is, in some sense, the beginning of tribalism. Or at least
yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's not my theory. Professor Chancellor James Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization. That's what the whole book is about.
I've read that in the past, but I'm not sure I came away with that in terms of, in my conscious memory. Because that's of extreme interest, because as you know, tribalism is hampering the advance of Africa today.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have 2 products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Click here to claim your free book. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back. Click here for more information.
I mean, and we see it all the way from Ethiopia over to Nigeria. When you just talked about the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa, and the Fulani, and the country is divided up. So those are the main, tribal entities. But all of West Africa, you see it, and you see it in Congo, because that was encouraged, shall we say, by Leopold and the Belgians and the French, etc. So I think this is important for us to understand that tribalism is an outcome of the destruction of nation states and the kidnapping of our people. I mean, 20% or so of the African population, and this is an African population that in the prime of their youth, so that their contributions to civilization and development of their civilizations, were retarded over time, and this is something that we don't take cognizance of, in terms of saying, well, where's Africa at, and why is Africa lagging in this and in that and in that? Certainly China has moved forward, India is moving forward, but Africa is still this kind of basket case. But it's not a basket case because of any intellectual problems. It's a basket case because of the invasions of Africa from the outside that have been so destructive. I think I'd like us to get back to this next time. Certainly, we need to explore a little deeper that whole business of African participation in the slave trade, because that's something that's thrown at us all the time by Europeans. That you sold your brother into slavery. I mean, we just bought them, but you're the one that sold them, which, as you know, is untrue. But we need to outline that deeper in terms of, if a guy is holding a gun to your head and he said, give me your wallet, he said, take the wallet, don't pull the trigger. And this was very much the situation that was going on there. And then I think we need to follow our brothers and sisters as they traveled across the Atlantic into the Western world and detail, shall we say, the horrors of our enslavement process. So that's where I think we need to go in our next few sessions. But this has been extremely enlightening, as usual. Thank you so much for your knowledge. Until
Thank you
next
very much, sir.
Okay, Robin, wonderful.